Letters to the Vampire Queen by Stjepan Siesh. Narrated by Mary Robinette Kowal. 1. Girl in a blood-silver collar. "Will you ever return?" he asked. A mirthless smile adorned her face. "Maybe, if someone loves me enough to fix what has been broken." He listened to her voice, looking for hope in those words but found none. Her hand touched the surface of the mirror, causing it to ripple, and then she quietly uttered her last words on this world. "No, I don't think I will return." She walked through it, and he was left alone. He did as he was told, and shattered the mirror. And so it was done. It would be a long time till Lysandra would be able to read these words, mostly because she couldn't read, nor could she write. She had no interest in such things. In truth, very few did, for in Dalkhoffberg everyone was more interested in numbers. Numbers kept your silver in order, after all. Compared to that, what good were letters? Lysandra would have agreed with this back then, back before the mirror and the written words, and the lonely queen in the castle on the other side of sunset. Before all that, Lysandra was busy. Lysandra turned to see Mr. Rudd's wrinkled smile. She said nothing, just raised her eyebrows and gestured to a bag containing several rocks. He inspected it with interest and nodded approvingly. Lysandra smiled back at him, a wry, cunning grin. Rudd knew it well. "Okay, what did you find?" Her smile widened as she produced a small piece of rubble adorned with an old, dirty ornament. "In the morning sunlight she looks ethereal." Rudd thought for a moment. Pale skin framed with her, albeit perpetually messy, hair. It was red when it wasn't overly greasy, and those eyes. Green they were and wild as the nature itself. Truth be told, there was an attractive woman under all of the dirt. Properly cleaned and dressed, she might even pass for nobility. If it wasn't for her hands, that is. Yes, you knew her life by those hands. Calloused and rough, and holding to a polished piece of rubble streaked with a gold pattern. "Where did you find it?" he asked, his eyes now riveted to the stone in her hands. "The riverbank," she muttered. She was no longer smiling, but instead a small guilty frown lingered uncomfortably on her face. Rudd asked no more questions about it. He knew well enough that some of the greatest treasures were often found in forbidden places. And this was a treasure, all right. It was a piece of decorative wall ornament, taken from the throne room itself. This, Rudd was sure of. A symbol of a rose was carved into the black surface of the stone and covered with gold. Oh yes, this was the real deal, and it would fetch a great price. It was going to be a good day. It was the last day of Queen's Fall. He took a deep, satisfying breath of morning air and stretched, old spine cracking as Lysandra grimaced once more. There he was, cracking like an old wandering skeleton again. She would usually tease him about it, tell him to go back to his grave whenever he did this. That day, however, her jokes felt wrong. In the morning sun, he looked older than usual, and for the first time, she found herself worrying about the old man. She would never mention this to him, of course. He had no time for such grim talks, he would often tell her. And perhaps he was right, she thought. She closed her eyes and stretched, mimicking him, and a faint pop echoed in her back. "By the spirits, it's contagious," she chuckled. The sun was already over the wall, and the trader's district glistened as it always did on a good day. Thousands of mirrors everywhere the eye could see, and just as many customers meandering around. The streets were spotless here. More than even the seats of power, these streets were the heart of the city. At any given point, there were over 10,000 people in Dalkhoffberg, and only about 2,000 of them lived there. The remaining 8,000? Rudd called them the blood of the city, pun mildly intended. Pilgrims, travelers, Desperate people coming for the one thing Dalkofberg was best known for. And today, that blood of the city would circulate through his store. Rudd smiled, and like an old vampire, he would feast on them. And then he glanced at Lysandra. Well, they would both feast. He chuckled and opened the store door. Lysandra entered first, while Rudd stayed outside for a moment to perform his amusing little morning ritual. On the outside of the city wall, beyond the dissipating morning mist, a massive ruin of a dilapidated castle cast its shadow onto the city. It wasn't destroyed completely, but no doubt it had seen its better days. Rudd looked towards it and took a small bow. "I still remember, my queen," he whispered. Then he straightened himself, old spine cricking, stars dancing before his eyes. He laughed, still looking at the castle, and shrugged. "But for how much longer? Who knows?" he said while turning back towards the store. In the back room of the store, where products were stored and maintained, Lysandra observed the rubble she had gathered. Most of it was unimpressive looking, but undeniably it was the same dark stone from which Castle Dalkoff was built. There was good profit in it, for sure, but that wasn't the real score. She took the decorative stone out of a small pot in which she had previously poured the cleaning solution. All of the rocks she gathered were of the same black stone. That's what made them valuable. Fallen rubble, each of them once part of Castle Dalkoff. However, this specific fragment was different. Oh yes, Rudd would certainly sell it as a piece of the throne room, all the while laughing at the naivety of pilgrims that passed through his store. And yes, Lysandra would inevitably grin at the old man's enthusiasm, all the while keeping her little secret. No, she didn't find the stone on the riverbank, though this was her most common little lie. Sure, one could get lucky and find some of it washed upon the riverbank every now and then. Not this particular stone, however. She took it out of the cleaning solution. Glistening and sparkling, the rock seemed to shimmer brighter than the gold covering its intricate ornaments. These ornaments perfectly matched the flowery, decorative moldings within the great hall of the Forbidden Castle. She would know. After all, that was where she found it. Satisfied with the result, she set the stone aside, wiped her hands, and turned to a table full of mirrors. No, not just the table. The whole room was full of mirrors. Mirrors and silver wire and an extensive set of jeweler's tools. The tools took up most of the north wall. In her nearly 5 years working at the Broken Fang, Lysandra had mastered using all of them. She loved working with the silver wire, entwining and twisting it into delicate ornamental frames for the small mirrors. She found it as focusing as it was rewarding, and the results of her effort became readily apparent. Mirrors, however, were a different story, all carved into the same exact peculiar shape, an irregular rhomboid form with one side slightly curved. Lysandra frequently cursed that part. It curved inward, which made it notoriously difficult to recreate. Handling mirror glass was her least favorite duty. No matter how carefully you did it, small cuts were inevitable, and worse than that were the glass splinters. Unfortunately for her, those same mirrors were their best-selling items. Every mirror sold in the trader's district was a recreation of Alyssa's shard, the sole mirror of the vampire queen, and any passing traveler could own a blessed replica of it for a silver piece or 5, depending on size. These mirrors were special. These mirrors repelled vampires. "These mirrors need polishing," Lysandra said to the empty room. It was just past noon when the first chimes sounded and the doors of the Broken Fang opened. Lysandra put away the mirror charm and the cleaning kit. She could hear the familiar sounds, giggling women, the overconfident voice of a young man. She rolled her eyes, knowing that it would be an hour at least till the store was cleared of the obnoxious perfume they used. This was always the case. She placed the clean mirror charms onto a tray. She turned toward one of the larger mirrors in the room and looked at herself. With one swift motion, she ruffled up her hair. In its messy state, it made her look wild, almost primal. Honestly, that was what customers expected to see. Witches and warlocks and mystics, for who better to sell them what they were after? She smirked and approached the doors that opened into the store itself. She did as she always had and stood behind it, eavesdropping, waiting. Mr. Rudd instantly appeared from behind the counter with all the flair of a traveling circus performer. An old man, yes. Most of his hairline gone the way of his good looks, but there was still something to him. Deeply carved wrinkles and sunken eyes gave him a sense of importance that was always punctuated by his raspy voice. To a stranger, he could have been an aged warlock hiding the secrets of his craft behind his dark brown eyes. To those who knew him, however, he was an entertainer, ready to weave tales of terror for his eager audience. That is what we all are, Lysandra thought to herself. Entertainers, purveyors of stories and lies. A wandering circus stopped in its tracks, and now our audience comes to us. Day after day, chime after chime, they open the doors of one of our many curio shops. Buying fragments of the walls of Castle Dalkoff, blessed relics and mirror shards. It was a curious assortment of items with one thing in common. All of it was meant to protect people from vampires. Vampiric protection was, in fact, the biggest business in Dalkoffburg. Lysandra peeked behind the half-closed doors at the colorful trio that entered the store. Young rich man, noble perhaps, all gilded and pampered, wearing a gold-trimmed violet suit and topped with a darker violet hat and cloak. Lysandra dubbed him the Violet Man. Two women by his sides needed no creative naming or introduction. This was, after all, the traders' district, and these women were very much interested in tradings of their own, and what a little merchant circle it was. Rudd in front, two women at his sides, and the Violet Man caught in between. Lysandra grinned. This is no trading. This man is about to get mugged, she thought, stifling a laugh. Still, there was no rivalry between the interested parties. The Violet Man seemed perfectly well endowed and interested in satisfying both Mr. Rudd and the ladies of the night. After all, the only relevant bulge in the store was on his hip, and it was brimming with silver. "Young traveler, what ill wind brings you to the Broken Fang?" Mr. Rudd growled, while piercing the Violet Man with his gaze. Lysandra smirked as the man suddenly regained his composure. His mind snapped away from the heaving breasts to his left and right and plunged suddenly into this dark world of omens. If he'd taken a moment to look at either of his two ladies, he would have noticed their winks. They knew. We all knew. Dalkoffburg was the city of lies, and Rudd might as well have been, if not its king, then at least a nobleman. "I was informed this was a good place to purchase vampire trinkets," the Violet Man said while taking a quick look around the store. Lysandra always found this amusing. Rudd made it his business to put some coins in the hands of local street beggars and vagrants. Carefully chosen, of course. If they looked remotely like a witch or a sorcerer, they more than likely had Rudd's money in their pocket. And that money was followed by a set of instructions. "Bring them to me, to the Broken Fang. Tell them that we have the best trinkets." He would always emphasize that word. It was a good word. It brought an aura of falsehood, of irrelevance. With irrelevance came a certain sense of ease. Rudd wanted his customers to enter at ease. They would exit scared and with their pockets significantly lightened. "Trinkets?" Rudd boomed. The Violet Man was visibly taken aback, all confidence gone from his smooth face. "Young man, this is Dalkoffburg. We do not trade in trinkets. Powerful talismans, oh yes. Repellents. Sacred relics that will protect your family from vampires. All of those you will find here. But if it is trinkets you seek, look elsewhere. The Broken Fang trades in salvation." The Violet Man, confused for a moment, looked around the store for a second time with the eyes of a blind man who could suddenly admire a sunrise. There was a trace of reverence on his face as he looked at the mirror charms and fragments of the walls of Castle Dalkoff. He was buying the charade, and, like many before, he would end up buying much more than that after Rudd was done with him. Rudd was intentionally going about his business, making himself seem too important to disturb. Lysandra was sure that the Violet Man was not used to this balance of power. He seemed like the kind who expected others to cater to him. "I meant, no offense, sir. My family just arrived here yesterday, and, well, my uncle was lost to the Dark Curse 5 years ago, and we heard that if we want protection from the night kind, we must go to Dalkoffburg." "You heard right," Rudd said in a more commiserating tone. "Tell me, sir, what do you know of our city?" Rudd's voice was softer now, almost confidential, a well-trained act. The Violet Man felt almost invited by this change of tone and came closer. "They say you people killed a true ancient vampire, a queen." "They are correct. Alyssa of the House Dalkoff, the vampire queen. She ruled this region mercilessly for many centuries, all along feasting on the blood of young women. People hated her, but dared not challenge her power. This remained so until the day she went mad and unleashed her hordes upon us. This would have been the end of us all if it wasn't for Harker Devlin. For years he was hated by all for serving the Queen. What none of us knew was that during his service he took every chance to learn about her, to seek and eventually find her weakness. And so, on the night she attacked the city, Harker went into the castle and put an end to her." Rudd paused. The silence was broken by the Violet Man. He had the face of someone trying to make sense of a senseless idea. "I heard stories of well-armed Inquisitor squads barely taking down a lesser vampire thrall. How, then, does one man alone take down a true vampire?" Rudd smiled. "Like I said, Harker had served her for years, and in the end he had gained her trust. And in her trust, he found out the one way to defeat a true vampire." Rudd took a vampire charm carefully, with an air of importance. He looked at his reflection and smiled for the first time. "Do you know why vampires cast no reflections in a mirror?" "No." The Violet Man mumbled while visibly fascinated by the charm. "They are not creatures of this world. They do not belong here, but are merely anchored here by the act of drinking of our blood. No, they belong to a dark place that exists on the other side of a very special mirror, the only mirror that can reflect them for who they are. A soul mirror. You destroy that mirror, you destroy a true vampire's link to this world, and they perish. 358 years ago, we put a stop to the blood tide, and never since has any vampire dared to come near our city, because they know that we know how to end them." "So these mirror charms," the man interrupted. "Blessed relics," Rudd replied. "North of the town, near the old walls, you will find a black building. It is a shrine for the only remaining piece of Alyssa's soul mirror. All of these charms have at some point reflected that mirror, and through that act gained the power to repel vampires. We all wear them. We never leave our homes without them." The Violet Man turned to his escorts, only to see their serious faces as each produced a small charm of their own. The man looked around, noticing the pieces of rubble and ornaments. "And what are those?" "Pieces of the Castle Dalkoff. And put a few of them in your home, and no vampire will ever approach it." "How much?" 12 pieces of rubble and 16 mirror charms, all bought by just one customer. Lysandra knew Rudd well enough to know how hard he was suppressing laughter. She would have laughed as well, however, she knew better. Trading had to be done, and this was her cue. Lysandra entered the room, a wild-looking red-haired young woman with piercing green eyes, a perfect picture of the witchy wild women often mentioned in stories that end with, "And then she devoured his soul." It was intentional and as exaggerated as Rudd's performance. She wore a dark green dress and was unadorned except for a peculiar collar around her neck. A strange thing, really. It seemed to be made of iron, however, there were trails of red and what looked like silver in it. When it caught the sunlight, you saw it for the spirit metal that it was. All of its imperfections would suddenly vanish, and it was as if someone captured moonlight in metal and forged it solid. The violet man observed Lysandra's collar with no small amount of curiosity. "Thank you, Lysandra," Rudd said. She remained silent. It was best that way. It kept customers unsettled, made them ask questions. She looked to the side and moved her hair away, a calculated move. The strange collar glistened brightly once more. And like a crow, the violet man was fascinated by this shiny thing. "What is that?" He pointed at the collar. Rudd stuttered for a moment with feigned surprise. "Oh, that? Nothing. Lysandra, you may go now." As if on cue, the violet man said, "Stop!" He stared at the collar, curiosity burning in his eyes. Then he looked suspiciously at Rudd. Lysandra bit her lip hard to prevent herself from laughing. He was hooked. "What are you not telling me? What is that thing around her neck? I've never seen anything like it." Rudd hesitated. "It's something better, isn't it? You're hiding it for yourselves while selling strangers." "Young man, I would choose my words carefully," Rudd boomed. Once again, all confidence melted from the violet man, and he was just a pampered child of privilege being scolded by a superior. Then Rudd sighed. He looked around the store, then glanced at the store door as if he were checking for anyone listening in on their dealings. Seemingly satisfied that they were alone, he leaned in closer to the violet man, and in a secretive tone said, "It is the blood-silver collar." Both of the ladies of the night gasped and then rushed to interrupt Rudd. "Sir, you can't!" Rudd took 2 silver coins and handed each of them one. Then he gave them a meaningful look, and all conversation ended there. Lysandra was genuinely surprised by this turn of events, but still decided it was best to play along. "What I say here has not been said, nor was it heard. Understand?" The violet man leaned forward and nodded. "The queen was defeated. This much is true. The problem was, nobody really knew if defeated meant slain or just banished back to the world of veils and shadows. One can never tell with such creatures. Question was, if she persisted, would she return?" Rudd paused in order to let that question settle. "Some believe that the lust of a young woman called her to us in the first place. Others speak tales of love and betrayal, and a girl whose name was lost to us." A small smile grazed Lysandra's face as a memory of a song and of sunflowers briefly touched her mind. "Melanie of the night," she thought, but said nothing. Rudd carried on in his confidential tone. "Was it lust? Or was it love? I can't tell you which is true, as oral tradition is as true as the storyteller is sober, and my good man, storytellers are rarely sober. In the truth, it mattered little to the city elders. They concluded that any young woman seeking the warmth of another woman could call her back. In order to prevent this from ever happening, we placed our strongest protection on these women. The only thing that would repel any and all dark forces forever. The blood-silver collar." Rudd was selling those words with the gravitas of someone uttering the holiest of words. The violet man looked at Lysandra for a moment. A peculiar, almost reverent expression touched his face. He seemed to be going over everything he was just told, weighing his decision. His hand restlessly fiddled with his coin purse. Then he turned his attention back to Rudd. Deadly serious, he asked a simple question. How much? Very expensive, both for its protection and the risk I am taking. The violet man now stood upright, looking smugly confident. A lost man finally on his familiar road. Do I seem like someone who can't afford it? Rudd smiled and shook his head. No, my good sir, not at all. The bell chimed as the trio left the store, only their noxious perfume permeating the air. Lysandra smirked and looked at Rudd, examining the silver coins. He looked at her, smiled, and tossed a coin her way. The night girls are new, she said, grinning at the old man. He tapped his temple while returning a wry old man smile that made his lips disappear. You want a customer, you pay off a few vagrants. You want a rich customer, you talk to some ladies of the night. Still, she said while fiddling with her collar, you are risking quite a lot selling him these collars. Rudd glanced at hers. It's hardly the same thing. These aren't made of blood silver. More than that, unlike yours, these can be removed, he said as he unclipped one of the fake collars. There was something in his voice as he uttered that last sentence. A trace of pity, perhaps, Lysandra thought. Old man was getting soft. Well, in any case, you made enough to close this store for a month, she said. He frowned at this idea. We can't close our doors just yet. This is the big week. Tomorrow night is the Queen's Fall. So many pilgrims, so many poor souls seeking protection, he said in a mockingly sanctimonious tone. They both shared a laugh. It was a long-running joke in the traders' district that people who dealt with vampire protection rarely put any faith in vampires themselves. Oh, they heard all the scary stories from pilgrims. Terrible tales of entire villages killed and traveling caravans slaughtered. Stories were abundant, and people saw vampires in every shadow. Rudd and Lysandra both, however, saw different monsters in those same shadows. After all, Dalkofburg was a big city. You live there long enough and you'll see horrors that need no otherworldly interference. They knew far scarier stories of brigands who killed people with hand-crafted claws, which they would use to rip the throats of their victims. They had seen such weapons traded in the shadowy corners of the city. The whole thing was almost devilishly clever. If you could pin the murder on a vampire, it was no longer a matter of the law. It was left to the Inquisition to deal with, and the Inquisition wasted no time looking for a human culprit. This was true for most kingdoms, but it worked much better in Dalkofburg. Officially, this was a vampire-free city, and the elders would do anything to keep it so. Anything else would be bad for business. What this meant was, if a death seemed vampire-inflicted, instead of forwarding the corpse to the Inquisition, the body would be unceremoniously burned, and none would be the wiser. They were just another unfortunate soul swallowed by the dark. Accidents happen. Yes, Lysandra and Rudd believed in vampires in general, hard not to with the city history being what it was. They were, however, extremely skeptical about their alleged abundance. The truth of the matter was that vampires were a rare breed. Lies about them, however, those were in high supply, both beyond the outer wall and within the crowded streets of the traders' district. Rudd made the best of it all, and started trading on those lies like many around him. He just did it better. Lysandra sighed and said, I'll go back to the workshop before more of them arrive. We still have at least 9 good hours before they all make their way to... Her thoughts drifted off and the sentence was left unfinished. Then she took the tray of mirror charms and turned to leave to her workspace. It's the bonfire night tonight. He said it in a conversational tone, yet the words felt heavy in the air. She stopped. Every year they did it, the week celebrating the fall of the vampire queen. The bonfire night was to commemorate the citizens gathering and deciding to put a stop to the tyrant. Every year there was song and dance. Lysandra was a part of it last time when she was still 17 before. She touched the collar absent-mindedly. "It's been almost 5 years now," Rudd said. "It has," she nodded. "Where do you go? During it, I mean." Rudd observed her with curiosity. Bonfire nights were off-limits to her kind. The collared ones. The night blossoms. "I go and spend time with the others. We drink, we eat, we fornicate, and in the end, we spit at the town." She smiled at Rudd. The smile never touched her eyes. For a moment, as she turned to leave, her hair moved away, and Rudd noticed the scar on the back of her neck. A burn, where they forge-welded the collar. Rudd said nothing. He sank into silent thoughts. He thought about lies, about forgotten things. He mused on old legends that only old people knew but kept to themselves. Very few knew them in their original form. Rudd did. He knew why, among all the collared women, it was Lysandra who was scrutinized the most. He knew why he had to intervene twice, as some of the more nervous elders suggested that maybe they could just get rid of the girl. All this fear because of greed that broke the 5, and an old story most had forgotten. A story of a girl with red hair and green eyes and the broken heart of a queen. Rudd knew why the city feared girls who sought the affection of other women. Rudd knew why. And even though she never told him this, Lysandra also knew why. Lysandra knew because a queen had told her. Two. Girl with Sunflower Eyes. It was almost 5 years ago, before Mr. Rudd and the broken Fang. Lysandra was 18 when she was caught. Among his 3 children, the girl in question was the only daughter of Lord Barnaby Dunstan. Laura Dunstan, that was her name. Back then, Lysandra served as a kitchen helper at Laura's house. On any given day, the chances of the two of them ever meeting in person were slim at best, as Lysandra knew well enough that her unsightly, unkempt visage was not something the lord and his family needed to see. No, her spot was in the kitchen and her exit through the back doors. Their first encounter was a matter of chance, really. See, it all began with a slippery bathtub. Lady Laura had decided to take a lengthy bath, and her maid, old Harriet Barnes, took this time to attend to some other duties that required her attention. Now, the bathtub was a new thing, a fancy piece of craftsmanship imported from the South. It was said that all the rich ladies exclusively bathed in these, and Lord Barnaby Dunstan would have nothing but the best for his daughter. And the best it was. Polished to look like glass on the inside and out, and trimmed with decorative ornaments that served both to please the eye and provide a gripping surface when one tried to exit it. Alas, to Lady Laura's misfortune, she was unaware of this and had, in fact, been sitting in the tub at the wrong end. This end had no such ornaments and was, like the rest of the tub, glass smooth. And therein was the problem. Laura tried to leave the tub, however. Her hand slipped, and while trying to keep her balance mid-fall, she sprained her leg. This, of course, caused quite the chaos among the staff. By sheer chance, there were no female servants around, and it was inappropriate for men to walk in on the naked girl, so they did the best they could. They shouted at the doors to assure Laura they were sending help. The house steward pulled Lysandra out of the kitchen and took her apron. "Lady Dunstan needs your help in there. You will help her get decent and help her come out. Don't waste time and don't bother the young lady. Do you understand, street rat?" Lysandra nodded, shocked to find herself in a corridor full of concerned men. All of a sudden she felt the greatest urge to enter that bathroom, if for no other reason than to escape this crowd. These were house servants, she thought, and her place was not among them. She belonged in the shadows in the darker parts of the kitchen. Here, in plain sight of everyone, she felt terribly exposed. "Hurry!" And so she did. She entered the bathroom. Laura was still in the tub. The floor was covered in water, and Lysandra imagined the events that transpired. It was obvious, really. An awkward attempt at exiting the ridiculous tub had resulted in a slippery collapse. The steward sent me, lady." Lysandra avoided eye contact. Lara observed her with curiosity, and maybe even incredulity. Lysandra met her eyes for a moment, and in that moment she saw a fairy. That's how she remembered it, at least. Her face was beautiful, framed with honey-colored hair. Her lips were full, a deep shade of pink that contrasted harshly with her pale skin. And the eyes. There was something magical with those eyes. They both were and weren't brown. It was too difficult to catch it, as Lysandra didn't dare to look for too long. "Are you sure you can do it?" Lysandra looked back. Brown eyes, yet with almost golden centers. "I sprained my leg, and I need help getting out and getting dressed." Almost like a sunflower, she thought. "Are you deaf?" Lysandra snapped out of it. Lara's tone was genuinely curious. No, my lady." "Then are you sure you can lift me? You seem a bit malnourished." And then Lysandra noticed Lara blushing, which, come to think of it, may actually be the case. How about this? I am Lara Dunstan. Lysandra Streethold." Lara looked at Lysandra with some pity, and for the first time, Lysandra felt annoyed. "An orphan's last name," Lara said. "Well, we Streetholds are the largest family in Dalkofburg," Lysandra defiantly answered. This was the go-to response of orphans in Dalkofburg. Every one of them with unknown parentage was given the last name of Streethold, and in those days it counted as the most numerous last name in Dalkofburg. Lara smiled, and Lysandra felt a little weak in her knees. Maybe Lara saw right. Maybe she was too weak to help her out. Lysandra's legs certainly felt like that at that moment. "Right, help you out," Lysandra blurted out, forcibly removing herself from a familiar path her mind seemed intent on walking. She took a cloth and proceeded to wipe the floor first. "No use getting you out, only to have you slip again and take me down with you." She heard Laura's soft chuckle and looked up at her, watching Lysandra curiously. "Green eyes and red hair and pretty," she mused out loud as she studied Lysandra. Lysandra stared at the floor, pretending to inspect it for wet spots, and allowing her hair to cover her face and hide an upcoming blush. She could feel it coming. It always started with a warm tingle in her ears. "Well," Lara considered, "pretty after, I'd say, a few hours in the bathtub. Some good hair brushing, a nice dress." Lysandra got up and offered her hand to Lara. Lara observed her rough hands. They weren't the hands of an 18-year-old girl. These hands saw labor and hardship. For a second, she considered adding that something had to be done about those. However, a quick glance at Lysandra's uncomfortable expression made her give up on the joke. Lara wasn't heavy. She was, however, naked and slippery, and so Lysandra found herself touching way more of Lady Dunstan than she could ever imagine. Mind you, at that moment, her misbehaving mind could imagine a lot. To Lysandra's great relief, she was strong enough to help her get out. Shortly after, while she was clumsily helping Lady Dunstan get dressed, old maid Harriet burst into the bathroom flustered. "I was dealing with the laundry when I heard, 'Oh, young lady, out of the way, street rat!'" she barked. Lysandra did as she was told and turned to leave. "Not street rat. Lysandra." Lara corrected the now incredulous Harriet. Lysandra smiled. So did Lara. That night, Lady Dunstan was keeping Lysandra awake far past the time when other girls at the working house were deep asleep. A fairy-like beauty with sunflowers in her eyes and soft, slippery skin. Lysandra buried her red face into the pillow. The next day came along, and the bathtub incident was well forgotten, as the Dunstan manor seemed to continue its functions as usual. Lysandra made her way through her little secret hidden paths and reached the kitchen. She left her satchel in the small alcove that also housed the brooms and assorted cleaning supplies. From that same alcove she picked up her apron. She quickly examined it. It was dirty, but not so bad that the cook would trouble her with washing it again. She fastened it and took the large broom. While her duties were predominantly kitchen-bound, over time she learned that they also expected her to sweep the ground in front of the kitchen, and since autumn was well underway, that seemed like an endless battle against the dying trees. She opened the large doors that led into the area of the manor that was mostly hidden from noble eyes. It was almost like a courtyard within a courtyard, opening to the main street leading to the traders' district. Here the carts would regularly enter and deliver food. Like the rest of the manor grounds, it was framed with trees and roses, and on a windy autumn day, it would be buried in leaves. Lysandra was happy to see it was not that kind of a day. It wouldn't take too long. Usually she loved this part of the job, if for nothing else than for the fact that it kept her out of the cook's reach. No orders, no cursing. Here she was left alone with her thoughts. And on that day, she was happy the work here would be short, because her thoughts seemed adamant to wander into places best left alone, such as sunflowers and soft touches and wet skin. "Street rat!" She was pulled away from her thoughts by a voice, not the cook's, but rather the house steward's. He was a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed mustache. William was his name, and he shared the same last name as Lysandra, Streethold. Whenever he called her street rat, there was a glint in his eyes, a smile kept hidden from all except those who knew. He, too, was a street rat, after all, and he moved up in ranks. Lysandra smirked a bit and turned to him. "Young lady." He started and stopped for a moment, searching for words. "You did well yesterday, I am told." "Oh?" Lysandra looked at him and noticed a package in his hands, wrapped in tailor's paper. "In fact, a young lady has gone through some effort to replace her personal maid." Lysandra said nothing, not sure what to make of this. William seemed to study the package in his own hands, then nodded at it. To Lysandra, he seemed like a man having an argument with an invisible opponent. He smiled and then, to her surprise, handed her the package. "Here, I guess we'll have to find a replacement for you as well." Then, looking at her shocked face changing to something akin to despair, he continued, "No, you are not being dismissed. You will be Lady Lara's personal maid from now on." He expected a response from Lysandra. Joy, maybe even a happy hug. He had seen people react like that before, but what he got baffled him. She just stood there like a statue, her ears growing alarmingly red. He didn't know what to make of this, and then, when she failed to take the parcel, he grew annoyed. He didn't have time for this. He shoved it at her and grumbled, "Here, try it on. I can have it trimmed later if it's too loose." Lysandra stood alone next to a small pile of swept leaves, parcel in hand. It was soft. The paper crinkled under her now sweating hands. For the first time in a long time, she looked to her left, to the manor itself. A massive 4-story building surrounded by a vast courtyard, its spiked fences covered in roses. She usually avoided looking at it. To her, it always felt like trespassing. She remembered the first time she arrived there. She was 14 at the time. The house steward gave her and 3 other fellow street rats a short talking to. They learned some things about the manor and the Dunstans then and there, and the rest they picked up as they went about their duties. While the Dunstans were nobility, it was a recently acquired title. They were merchants, obscenely wealthy and extremely successful. With their newfound nobility, their public image changed significantly. Their usually private house soon became a place of many parties and meetings. With that came the need to expand the number of servants. Of the 3 street rats, only Lysandra kept her employment. And now, 4 years later, this street rat was to move up in this world. It should have been a moment of pure joy. There was better pay involved, and perks of the job. Good perks. Real food, not leftovers, drinks, and being around people other than the cook and the steward. Also, being around... Her ears once again turned ablaze. An hour later, Lysandra was in the main hallway passing a large mirror. Never before had she visited this corridor, and this was the first time she laid her eyes on this peculiar decorated mirror. What was peculiar about it was its shape. It was as if someone had an even larger mirror and broke it, taking a piece of it and framing it in decorative silver work. She guessed what it was, as even an orphan from the working house had seen that shape repeated over and over. It was often worn around people's necks or embedded into bracelets. Vampire protection. Years would pass before Lysandra would know this form by heart. There would come a time when she would be able to reproduce this shape with her eyes closed. Then and there, however, the mirror held no more importance to her than the black pieces of rock placed in different wall niches around the house. It was a thing that people did. She had learned early on not to question things that people did, especially rich people. It was easier that way. She stood alone in the hallway, observing her reflection in the vampire mirror. The dress was clean, and while it seemed to somewhat hang off of her, it looked presentable. Her hair, however, was a different story altogether. She had no comb or brush on her, and she had been summoned. Looking at the mirror, she tried fixing her hair by running her fingers through it. All she got for the effort was pain as her fingers snagged on the hidden tangles and the red mess on her head. She was disappointed to notice that this only made things worse, and it was too late already. She moved down the hallway to the large cream-colored doors of Laura's room. She knocked, and then for a second found herself trying to decide how she should address Laura. Certainly not just Laura. "Lady Dunstan? It's, Lysandra. The steward said you sent for me?" She heard a relatively distant, "Enter?" And she did. It was a vast room. A room of a spoiled child, Lysandra caught herself thinking. It wasn't mean if it was true, she then thought. And it definitely seemed to be so. Large mirrors, elaborate dresses and jewelry in all corners of the room, and small entertainments as well. Sewing kits, books, she noticed with surprise, and some sort of a musical instrument. Certainly not hers. And there, at the far end of the room, in a large bed, was Laura. The fairy creature from day before was, however, at the moment bereft of elegance as she struggled her way out of the sheets. Her leg was wrapped in thick bandages that emanated a potent scent. Ointments, Lysandra thought. The smell of them made her want to back off, but a sudden realization stopped her in her tracks. It was probably her duty to help Laura get up. She rushed to her side, however, Laura was by then already sitting on the bed. "I'm fine. Stand still for a moment. Let me look at you." Lysandra felt the familiar burning rising to her ears and was glad to know they were hidden by her messy hair. She stood in front of Laura, unsure if she should do something. Bow, perhaps? "Turn around," Laura said with an assuring smile. The smile did things to Lysandra, none of which were assuring. She did what she was told. Her new dark green dress rustled slightly as she turned. "I told them to make it dark green. I thought it would go nicely with your eyes." Lysandra stayed quiet, unsure what to say. And then she shuddered as Laura placed her palms around her waist, confidently gripping her. It wasn't an unpleasant sensation. "It's a little loose. Nevertheless, I think it would be a rash decision to have it trimmed. Instead, I think a week of good meals might fill in the gaps." She smiled and then looked up, her smile vanishing. "Lysandra, pull that footstool over here and also bring me that box from the cupboard." This was good. If nothing else, this was the job, Lysandra thought. At least her duties would stop her mind from acting stupid and going places it shouldn't. The box was on top of a cupboard surrounded by all sorts of makeup paraphernalia. Expensive-looking stuff, the lot of it. She took it and proceeded to pull the footstool towards Laura, making sure to center it in front of her so she could rest her leg on it. Instead, Laura put both her legs on the floor, grimacing slightly as her injured foot touched the cold marble. Lysandra quickly got down on the ground and helped her put on the slippers. Laura looked at her, slightly amused. Lysandra was anything but, as she was nearly drowned in the smell of the ointment. With great dismay, she realized that the smell was now on her hands, the intense scent of mint and something else she couldn't quite recognize. "Sit here." She looked up to see Laura gesturing at the footstool. She got up and was ready to sit facing her. "No, your back to me." Lysandra did as she was told, only slightly unnerved. Most of her jitters were due to the fact that this was a new situation. She didn't know the protocols of working in the house itself. It was a field full of traps, and she had to watch her every step and learn on her own. Yes, that was where most of her jitters originated. The rest... Laura pulled Lysandra's hair from her face with a smooth, soft hand, touching her cheek slightly as she did so. This made every hair on Lysandra's body stand up. The rest of her jitters came from being in the same room with Lady Laura Dunstan. Laura leaned in closer. Her scent permeated the air, a perfume strong enough to drown out the ointment at this distance. Lysandra never dealt well with perfumes. Most made her nauseated. Laura's made her a little lightheaded. It was the perfume, but it was something else as well. Something she had kept to herself for years, ever since she was first told of things people do in the night when they are together. Ever since she discovered things about her own body. She knew that she was a little off. It wasn't strapping noblemen who came visiting in her fantasies. When her friends talked about whom they liked, she would remain silent. No. Lysandra dreamed of softer hands and alabaster skin, and of ruby lips. Your ears are red, Laura chuckled as she moved Lysandra's hair to the back. Lysandra silently stared at the floor. She was painfully aware of her body's little quirk. And then she was painfully aware of her hair being pulled. She winced. Be still, Laura ordered as she dug into a stubborn tangle of red hair. Lysandra looked back as much as she could, only to notice that the box she handed to her tormentor contained all manner of combs and brushes and peculiar tools that wealthy girls use to achieve their ridiculous hairstyles. My lady, this isn't... Oh, it is necessary. If I am to spend most of my time in your company, I'd rather be looking at your beauty than wonder if a street rat is hiding a rat's nest in her hair. Lysandra didn't know how to even approach this comment. A street rat with rats in her hair? There was a time she would fight people for that kind of comment. At the very least, she would have objected to this, if it wasn't for the other thing. Laura Dunstan wanted to look at her beauty. A part of her hated this weak-in-the-knees, manner-made Lysandra. There was, however, no denying it. Her secret desires pulled her towards Laura. Suppressing those took the fight right out of her. You know, you don't have to be quite so subservient around me. Not knowing what to say to this, Lysandra simply mumbled, yes, my lady. Laura scoffed. I insisted you be brought here because I saw something in you. She pulled Lysandra, making her turn and face her. In that moment, when I said you were an orphan, you had fight in your eyes. Defiance. Laura caressed Lysandra's face, almost desperately looking for something. I spent my life with everyone bowing to my whims. I need the girl I saw for a moment there in that bathroom. The girl who said Streetholds were the greatest family in Dalkofberg. Lysandra finished the sentence and smiled. Some confidence poured back into her face. Laura held her face and smiled widely. There you are, Lysandra. I was worried. Lysandra could no longer suppress the smile, and then she blurted out, Also, how dare you imply I have rats in my hair? You pampered... Then she covered her mouth, eyes wide in disbelief at the words that escaped her. Laura's face was difficult to decipher. For a moment, Lysandra was sure she had just ruined everything. Then a loud, surprisingly snorty laugh erupted through the room. It was the snort that, in all its unladylike honesty, made Lysandra burst into a laughing fit of her own. They calmed down after a while. Well, Laura said with a restored sense of dignity, let's not be that blunt with each other. Then she leaned in and whispered, At least, not when anyone else is around. Lysandra heard the words and felt Laura's breath on her ear, and for a moment the world spun around her. Then the pain returned as Laura once again attacked the resilient tangle, and Lysandra suffered through it, ears red and a barely suppressed smile never leaving her face. In the next few weeks, she found her duties easy to handle. She would assist Laura in dressing and undressing from complicated clothes. Beyond that, she would take care of Laura's room and spend most of her time following her around. And then there were the perks. There was the food. She had sampled this food before in its stale form, and only once everyone from lord to butler to the cleaning staff had their pickings. This was something entirely different. Soft meats, fresh vegetables, warm bread that crunched pleasantly on its surface yet never below it. Broths that were made to be a fine meal instead of a last resort for ingredients that would spoil if left for another day. Soon Lysandra found her bony figure was filling out her maid dress very nicely. Laura made sure her hair was kept in order. There were times when Lysandra would find herself going to Laura's room and stopping in front of the vampire mirror that once reflected her messy visage. The young woman looking back at her was nothing like the tangle-haired street rat in a loose dress. Instead of shying back from her reflection, she would at times start flirting with the mirror. For a moment, she would allow herself to indulge in fantasies of sunflower eyes looking back at her. Lysandra was given a servant's room at the manor. It was one of the 6 servants' rooms available, and it was considered to be a great honor. These rooms were usually reserved for staff members who worked for the family for over a decade. Suffice to say, this wasn't met with great approval from the other servants, but none dared to mention it. Their looks, however, spoke loudly and rudely. The room was small in size, and yet it was comfortable. There was a nice, sturdy bed, a wardrobe, a small table, and a chair. It even had a window facing west. To Lysandra, this room was a kingdom. The food, the room, the dress. Any of these things alone would have been enough to make her smile. All of these benefits paled in comparison to her greatest joy. Every morning, she alone would enter Laura's room, bringing the ladies' breakfast with her. Every morning, Laura would invite her to share the meal. It was their secret, of course. They would spend the waking hours of the day together, talking and laughing. Laura would at times take the peculiar instrument Lysandra noticed on her first day, and to her great surprise, she could play it. And she would do so often. She would play the songs of the city, well-known ballads, and some that she composed herself. Lysandra especially liked the song that Laura called Melanie of the Night. It was a sad song about a green-eyed girl with red hair who was loved once and lost forever. Laura would always look at her and smile a cryptic little smile when she played it. Life was wonderful. Three. The tale the city forgot. It was dark outside when Lysandra woke, and yet it was definitely the right time. Autumn nights are lengthening, she thought while getting dressed. Her morning chores were a matter of routine by then. She made her way down to the kitchen and greeted the steward, who was already busy organizing the staff for the upcoming celebration. It was Laura's 19th birthday, but there were bigger things in store as well. The whole house was abuzz with rumors and speculations, as nobody failed to notice the perpetual smile on Lord Dunstan's face. This smile seemed to coincide with the royal councillor's frequent visits. The word was all over the manor corridors. Something big was about to happen. Lysandra ignored the rumors just as much as she ignored the rest of the house staff on any given day. In one way or another, they made it clear what they thought of her. To them, she was a street rat out of its place. They couldn't say this out loud, of course. Beyond the danger of offending Lady Laura by questioning her choice of servants, there was a simpler reason for keeping their mouths shut. Steward William would have a thing or two to say to them if ever those kinds of complaints were uttered. Lysandra habitually took the longer, more out-of-sight route to the kitchen. She used it during the old days when she had to carry the food over to the other servants in their own separate dining rooms. Some habits were hard to shake off. So was the discomfort of being around the old cook. She was a short-tempered, corpulent lady with a swift, merciless hand. Lysandra stood in front of the kitchen, waiting. That was the rule. If you weren't one of the kitchen staff, you stay outside and wait for the food to be delivered. A young girl, at most 14 of age, brought Lysandra her tray with Laura's breakfast. Lysandra smiled at the kid. The girl looked away timidly. Lysandra guessed a lot about her. A street rat and my replacement at the very least, she thought. And then she asked, "Are you a street hold?" The girl looked embarrassed for a moment and then muddled a barely audible, "Yes." Lysandra petted the girl and whispered confidently, I guess that makes us sisters." She took out a few copper coins from her dress and gave them to the girl. It was a fortune to a kid like that. The child struggled for words, as she was obviously not used to this. Lysandra knew the feeling well enough. She smiled warmly at the girl and said, "Now you listen to me. Do your work swiftly and keep out of the old fart's reach, and you'll go far, okay?" The girl giggled when Lysandra called the cook an old fart. "Street rat!" the old cook boomed from the kitchen. The girl looked back at the kitchen, and instinctively Lysandra did the same. She couldn't help it, for years of trained habit and all that. Then she laughed. "Go, and remember, out of reach, okay?" The girl nodded seriously and ran off. Lysandra couldn't help smiling again. Her smile was, however, quickly replaced by confusion as she found the hallway blocked by several armed members of the Royal Guard. She squeezed by them, avoiding eye contact, but even so noticed a few smirks that were quickly followed by, "Hey, servant girl, is that food for us? We would be honored if you would share it with us." Lysandra gathered her resolve and said, "This food is for Lady Laura Dunstan." She expected that mentioning Laura would get them to respectfully back off. What she saw on their faces, however, was some terrible realization dawning. Almost like a shock one gets when putting their hand into a rabbit hole and realizing it has been occupied by snakes. "Apologies," one of them said, his voice nervously cracking as he rushed the other three away. Lysandra was left in the hallway alone and confused. For a moment, she started considering the implications, the rumors. But then she turned to her old ways of thinking. "Let it go, Lysandra. This has to do with rich, important people's business, and you are neither rich nor important, nor is this any of your business." She shrugged mildly and went about what was her business. She took a quick glance at herself in the vampire mirror and smiled, satisfied. Laura's room was by then illuminated dimly by warm colors that bled through heavy reddish drapery pulled over the windows. The room faced east, and Lysandra found it to be a magical place during dawn. Rogue rays of light escaped into the room in places where the drapes met and to the left of the window. Bathed in the warm glow was a sleeping princess, a fairy creature, a magical being with warm eyes and... Not that morning. Laura was sitting at her table, absent-mindedly combing her hair. "Did the guards wake you up?" Lysandra asked while setting down the tray with Laura's breakfast. "What? No, I couldn't sleep." Lysandra looked at Laura, and Laura looked back at her, something in her face, restlessness and something else. Laura stared at her and then touched Lysandra's hair. Noticing the brush in Laura's hand, Lysandra raised her hands up in comical self-defense. "Oh no, not again. I brushed it myself. I swear by the spirits." Laura looked down at the brush, almost as if she just realized she was holding it. She set it aside. "No, it's just... I sometimes forget how beautiful you are." Laura's face still held a secret from Lysandra, but her effort to decode it was stopped in its tracks. This was always so when Laura called her beautiful. It always left Lysandra flustered and blushing. Yet even so, she knew something was off that morning. There was something in Laura's face and her voice that morning, with drapes still closed and only the stolen light entering her room. Something... Laura stood up and took Lysandra by the hand. "I want to show you something." Without a moment's hesitation, she took her outside. They climbed the stairs that led to the eastern tower. Lysandra knew this to be the library of Lord Dunstan. She never visited the place, of course, but she overheard the cleaning staff mentioning it. Truth was, most of Dunstan Manor was still a mystery to her. Lord Dunstan's study, the library, the armory, the trophy room, the master bedroom, guest bedrooms, all of these might as well have been foreign countries to Lysandra. Just like distant lands, she only knew of them from overheard conversations. And, just like distant lands, she had never personally laid her eyes upon any of them. Laura unlocked the great oaken doors and locked them behind her as they entered a large, well-illuminated room. Even with the drapes half closed, it too was facing east enough to be bathed in dawn's early glow. And what a room it was! In the center of it stood a massive table with curious devices scattered all over it. At first, these tools seemed haphazardly tossed on the table's surface. A closer look would reveal them to be spotlessly maintained. It was a creative mess, for sure, but there was no sign of neglect upon these items. As they passed them by, Laura remarked, "Explorers' tools. My grandfather used these to establish seafaring routes, and he passed them and the business to my father. Nowadays, my father uses these to chart new, safer trading paths." Surrounding the main desk were rows of shelves, wardrobes, and glass casings containing vast amounts of books and curios. There was a strangely pleasant smell to the place. All of the woodwork was well maintained. A scent of sweet-smelling oils used to polish the furniture filled the room with a sense of mystery. Lysandra liked this place. She looked out through the window and noticed they were high enough to see over the roofs of the houses and realized she could clearly see the abandoned Castle Dalkoff from here. Oh, she had seen it a few times before, when climbing high places of the city as a child. She and the other children from the orphanage would spend time on rooftops looking for bird nests and thinking up stories of the castle and the horrors that dwelt within it. "Lysandra?" She turned to see Laura with a book in her hand. The thing had seen better days, parts of it torn, irreparably damaged. Laura placed the book on the desk and gestured for Lysandra to join her. "Have you ever heard the story of Alyssa of House Dalkoff, the vampire queen?" Lysandra fought back a chuckle, thinking, "Of course I know the story. This is Dalkoffberg." So she said, "I know as much as anyone does in this town, I guess." Laura gave her a strange, cunning look. "Tell me then. Tell me your version of the story that everyone in town knows." Lysandra was confused for a second, but decided to play along. "Centuries ago, she ruled this region, a bloodthirsty creature of the night who kept a tight grip over all the land, and then one day she went power mad and attacked the city. People stood up to her, and her confidant betrayed and killed her by shattering her soul mirror. And that's why we celebrate Queen's Fall," she added, smiling like a proud student correctly answering a teacher's question. Laura wasn't smiling back. Instead, she opened the book, placed it on the table, and turned it to Lysandra. Lysandra looked at Laura and, with no hesitation, said, "I can't read." Laura smiled. "One of the things my father taught me was how important knowing the past is. This city, in its illiteracy, has forgotten many things. Oh, they carried over stories, but stories are malleable, ever-changing. A letter written speaks the truth to those who make the effort to seek it." Lysandra looked down. For some reason, she felt scolded. She never thought much of letters or books. Most people in Dalkoffberg had little use for them. "Some in this city have long memories, old memories, and they know stories in their original forms." She pushed the book toward Lysandra, who looked at her apologetically. Laura smiled. "No, just look." Lysandra did. The opened page was an illuminated piece, little writing. Most of it was filled with a picture, that of a dark-haired, pale woman encircled in roses, giving her heart to a woman with green eyes and red hair. "This here?" She pointed at the letter. "It says, 'Alyssa, Queen of Roses, and Melanie. Ever may they rule kindly, and ever may their love blossom.'" Lysandra frowned a little. "Queen of Roses?" "Like I said, there is another story lost in the past, and seemingly intentionally so," she said, stroking the torn-out edges of long-lost pages. "My father insisted on me learning to read. He said, 'A queen to be needs to have the foresight to decide on the future as much as the knowledge of what was lost.'" Lysandra looked at her. There was now sadness on her face, a deep pain she was trying to hide. It was then and there that Lysandra realized the rumors were true. She knew why royal advisors were often seen talking to Lord Dunstan, why the house was buzzing with excitement, and now it made sense why the royal guard was prowling the grounds. Laura was of marrying age, and King Franz had a son a few years older. The Dunstans' wealth was vast enough to grant them a title of nobility. Many wondered about that, however. It all made sense if one considered the laws of the land. Royalty could only marry into other nobility. So it's true. Laura looked at her. The rumors. You are to be our future queen. Laura's eyes welled up. Lysandra moved closer, unsure what to do. Laura stopped her. We'll talk about this later, but first you have to know why I brought you here, why I wanted you in my service. Lysandra backed off, suddenly a little scared. What is this all about? It is about love. Laura sat down and pulled out a chair for Lysandra, who speechlessly joined her. Laura then pulled the book closer once again. This was a long time ago. 6 centuries, some say. Even the book is of no real help here. Dalkaufberg was a border village next to a small fortress that kept changing occupancy depending on which force was invading it at the time. And then it all changed the day the queen arrived. She came from the lake and saved a girl from attackers. This girl then brought her to the village, and there Alyssa saw great suffering. And so she laid waste to the usurpers in the Night of Blood. She then took to her the girl she saved, Melanie, a girl of red hair and eyes of spring grass. Melanie was her beloved. Today that would get you collared, but back then, who would think of it? Who would dare? She said, smiling, and there was something in those sunflower eyes, a desperate longing. It was there the whole morning, the riddle of Laura's face now laid bare. Laura was silent for a moment, her eyes pinned to the pages. She looked restless. From there on, the book is destroyed. No other information about Alyssa or Melanie. Only these lines at the very last page, added, I presume, by whoever destroyed it. It says, Melanie, the betrayer and the mother of destruction, lover to the blood beast. Forget her, bury her in the past. All the stories say the queen went mad with power, but I think that maybe she went mad with love. Lysandra said nothing. Her ears, however, spoke loudly as they swiftly turned that special shade of red reserved for those moments when Laura would call her beautiful. This is what I was thinking of that day in the tub when you entered the bathroom. Here I am, the future queen, and my own red-haired, green-eyed enchantress there by my side. It was a funny thought at first, yet the more I looked at you, the more it appealed to me. The more you appealed to me. Lysandra could hear the blood pounding in her ears. I loved this story, a story of a queen who loved a woman and loved her enough to go mad for her. Maybe it is just me connecting the stars in the sky to make a picture. I certainly don't have all the pages here to know it, but ever since I read it, it felt true to me. And here I am now, about to be wed to a man I don't know or have any attachment to. I will be a queen someday, and yet I think of this story of Alyssa and Melanie and feel myself desperately wanting to do something entirely mad, and it scares me. Laura restlessly fiddled around with the lace trimming on her dress until it tore off. She looked at it and sighed. A tear dropped. Melanie of the night. Laura looked up. Lysandra was looking at the book. Your song, Melanie of the Night. It is about her, then. Laura nodded. Lysandra mused over the image and then spoke her thoughts. A green-eyed beauty who captured the heart of a queen and drove her. She looked into Laura's eyes, sunflowers in full bloom, sunlit and wild. Mad with love. Laura finished the sentence and kissed Lysandra with the passion of an unchained animal. Lysandra's mind momentarily abandoned all reality as her senses were drowned. The softness of Laura's lips. Her hands, one around Lysandra's waist, other buried in her hair. The scent of Laura's perfume, tender, not obnoxious, and the sound of breathing. Then she took it all in and grabbed onto Laura with equal passion, equal hunger, a longing finally released. Then their lips parted for a moment. It was long enough for Laura to ask of her a simple thing. Take off your dress. Before Lysandra could say anything, she was once again drowned in Laura's embrace. Even if she thought of saying something, she could no longer remember it. It couldn't have been that important anyway, she thought. The doors were locked. They were alone. The morning light was the only witness to their passion, and it made for a poor witness, as it would soon be on its way looking at other places, other people, and they would be left to themselves. Laura Dunstan, the future queen, lady of the manor. Then and there Lysandra belonged to her. And with that joyous thought, Lysandra proceeded to remove her dress as Laura eagerly helped her with the trickier bits. Soon she was nude before her lady, who was still dressed. Laura stood and moved the astrological devices on the table and then told Lysandra to climb on the table itself. The wood was cold, she noticed as she lay on the surface, covering her mouth to hide a silly grin. She was looking up at an illustrated ceiling, keeping her mind occupied by counting the painted stars, trying her best not to get completely crushed by the moment. She heard the sound of Laura's dress as it fell to the ground, a faint rustle as Laura exited the bundle of cloth. And then a touch. Gentle hands moving up her thighs. Very unlike her own, and for a moment she grew nervous. Her own rough hands. No pampered life of the last 2 months could completely remove the rough scarring of old calluses. Hands moved upwards towards her tenderness, and she shuddered down to her toes as she felt a kiss planted there. She looked down and saw Laura, Lady Dunstan, the future queen, looking up at her, sunflower eyes in full bloom. She's a wolf, she thought for a moment. She is a wolf, and she will have me whole. And she did. Lysandra closed her eyes and felt Laura move upwards, kissing her all the while as she left those most sensitive areas. For a moment, Lysandra wanted nothing more than to push her back down, but it was a brief moment as soon as she felt Laura's fingers reach inside her, and she arched her back instinctively. She grabbed Laura and searched all over her body, not looking, afraid to look, for the moment was too dreamlike, and it would surely evaporate if she dared to look again. Soon her hand found the place, wet to the touch. Her mind no longer dwelled on whether or not her hands were rough. She sunk her fingers into that secret place and started exploring. Laura moaned and started kissing her. And so they remained embraced, one hand around the other's neck, and one firmly planted between each other's legs, lost in the bliss that had been denied for so long. Sunlight had by then warmed the room and the dark surface of the sturdy old table. Lysandra touched the warm surface of the wood and, amused by it, said to the sky, "Where was this warmth when I first got on this thing?" Laura smirked while placing her hand on the table next to Lysandra's, feeling the same warmth. "I think part of this is our doing." Lysandra smiled, embarrassed. The rest of the manor went about its business, preparing for many things. A birthday, an engagement, big announcements. A hectic buzz of a large beehive, and up in the library, there was silence. "So, what now?" Lysandra asked while looking at the ceiling once more. Now we get dressed. I do have a party to attend, so maybe brush our hair as well, she said, staring at the mess that was Lysandra's hair. She presumed her own wasn't doing much better either. At the very mention of brushing her hair, Lysandra gave her a disgusted look. Laura kissed her gently, and the look was gone. Yes, my lady, she said, now smiling. They got dressed, and Lysandra went out first, checking the hallways. She waited a bit until the maid left the main hallway before signaling Laura to go. Soon they were both safe in Laura's room, but nothing about it was the same again. Lysandra helped Laura undress and put on her formal gown. She'd done so many times before, always making sure to touch her as little as possible. Not this time. She would take any moment she could to caress Laura. She helped her fix her hair, and as she lifted it up, she planted a few kisses on her neck. No, nothing would ever be the same again, Lysandra thought, as Laura tenderly brushed the tangles out of her unruly red hair. They were playing with fire, and the fire felt so inviting, so warm. Four. Burned by the fire. Lysandra felt exposed, naked, completely out of place. All around her were people of wealth and nobility, and she was a street rat pulled into this world of decadent wealth. She found small comfort in the fact that Laura didn't seem to like this crowd that much either. She found much greater comfort in the fact that nobody expected her to carry a conversation, so instead she could spend her time thinking about the library and Laura. Sure, these thoughts made her crave Laura's touches once again, but that was fine. Nobody could notice it, and even if they paid attention to a lowly maid, at most they would notice the embarrassed smile and red ears of a person out of their place. In fact, the only one who noticed was Laura, glancing in her direction every now and then, sharing a secret smile, making sure that every time she ordered her to do something, it was paired up with a gentle touch. She is claiming me as her own in front of everyone, and I am the only one who knows it, Lysandra mused as she went about bringing Laura a glass of wine. She pitied her in a way, all alone in the crowd of bored-looking people, having to carry conversations that were of no interest to her. Out of the way, street rat! Lysandra's thoughts were interrupted by Laura's former maid passing by with a jug of freshly poured wine. She set it onto a large table burdened with seemingly endless trays of food, dried meats, pastries, pickled and fresh vegetables arranged in small bowls topped with sour cream. Expensive food, and even so, it was nothing but an opening dish, something to nibble while you mingled. Lysandra was hungry, but still she was reluctant to approach the table while the old maid was still there. To her surprise, Laura gently placed her arm around hers and whispered, "You must be hungry. So am I. Get us some food, will you?" Lysandra smiled gratefully and moved over to the table. She took 2 small plates and started organizing a selection of food for Laura and herself. "We have climbed far, haven't we?" She heard a voice behind her. She didn't have to guess who it was. The old maid. Harriet Barnes was her name. She'd served the household for 20 years, and she didn't take kindly to being replaced by Lysandra. Lysandra had a feeling that she was part of the reason why the other servants in the house avoided her. "We haven't climbed anything," Lysandra answered, still not dignifying the old maid with a look. Then she turned to face her. "Lady Laura made her own choice and picked me to be her maid in your stead. That is all." She didn't expect any of this to make any difference to the old maid, but it was the truth. Well, all of the truth she would ever share. Harriet pursed her lips, giving Lysandra a cunning, measuring look. "I've dealt with your kind before, street rats who find their way into this house by our Lord's mercy only to be kicked out when caught in their thieving ways. And now you have found your way to the real riches, haven't you?" Lysandra took the plates and turned to leave. "I'm watching you, street rat, and not just with my own eyes." At that moment, a bell sounded and all eyes turned to Lord Dunstan and Laura at the center of the room. Laura glanced back at Lysandra with a mock accusatory look. Lysandra gestured with the food-laden plates and gave Laura an exaggerated, apologetic look. Lord Dunstan cleared his throat. "My lords, ladies, and those of you who strive to have that honor granted to them." A few people chuckled, but the silence was mostly uninterrupted. "We have gathered here today to celebrate the 19th birthday of my lovely daughter, Lady Laura Dunstan." And applause broken with sporadic cheers echoed through the room. Lysandra cheered as well, as her hands were too full for applause. "But more than that." The applause dimmed. "More than that." He seemed to be searching for words. "Our city has lived a long and strange history. A long time ago, we were governed by a cruel vampire queen, and yet we rose above it. We dethroned her. We broke her crown and scepter and said no. We, the people of Dalkofberg, stand for something better, and we redeemed our city and thrived because of it. Now they know us as the Holy City, as the Ray of Hope, and soon they will know us for another queen." An excited chatter spread through the room. Royal guardsmen cut open the path through the crowd, and Lysandra struggled to prevent the food falling from the plates she held. A well-dressed man walked through the newly made passage, followed by several important-looking people. The young man stood next to Laura and took her hand, never looking at her. "Today," Lord Dunstan continued, "today is a day for many celebrations, as I am honored to announce the engagement of my daughter, Lady Laura Dunstan, to His Royal Highness, Prince Wilbur of Herentia." A tumultuous applause erupted through the great hall as many took small bows, as much as the compressed crowd could allow. And even from a distance, Lysandra saw in Laura's face the same look she had that morning in the room. She stood there, plates in hand, as everyone toasted. She listened to the gossip of the crowd. "Dunstan's trading fleet and immense wealth will help fuel the colonization of the northern regions." "I hear it's not colonization they are planning. There is gold beyond Glass Lake. Getting to it is a problem and a massive expense, but with Dunstan's well-known mastery of establishing trading routes—" "They wouldn't dare go north, would they? That is too close to Devor's territory. It would be foolish to tread so close to a primal vampire's lands." This was rich people talk. Secrets shared among investors and old partners of Lord Dunstan, and all overheard by the keen ears of a former street rat. She didn't want to be there a minute longer. She was annoyed seeing these people treating Laura as a pawn, a trading commodity. And what hurt most was, they were probably right. A simple look at Laura and the prince spoke more loudly than any gossip. Stiff body language, her looking to the side, him above her head. It was a marriage of convenience, a loveless charade. Lysandra needed no rumors to recognize that. She desperately wanted to go up there, make an excuse, and pull Laura away and just escape. She did no such thing, of course. It was a childish thought. The rest of the evening was downright boring. Laura and the prince were seated separately from others, and lords would come by and congratulate them on their engagement and toast to the future of the kingdom and so on. Meanwhile, Lysandra sat down on a chair in the corner of the room and ate her food. She thought of Laura, of that morning, and found that the more she contemplated it, the unhappier she got. She saw her in the distance at the far end of the room and knew well that there was no future for them, especially not in Dalkofberg. Lysandra didn't know much, but she knew that. Her desires, her affections, would get her collared if she wasn't careful. She had seen women with such collars before. Not many of them. People avoided them, called them names, spoke of them in hushed tones. She found out early on that only the women who seek the affection of other women were collared. She was a child back then, so she naturally asked, "But why?" She remembered the answer of the orphanage's matron. "They whisper to the dark. That's why we have to collar them. Otherwise, the dark might have something to whisper back." She was young, 14 at the time. While all of this must have sounded terrifying to the matron, Lysandra had spent most of her time with other orphans. Scary tales were abundant among the children. She was regularly told of far creepier things than mere whispers in the dark. Suffice to say, she was hardly impressed. In fact, these vague attempts at intimidation made her even more curious. So they are collared, she thought. What of it? She had seen these women walk around, talk mostly to each other, smile, even laugh. Oh yes, Lysandra paid close attention to them. After all, she realized early on that she was a lot like them. At times, she would follow them around, observing them. One time she followed them all the way to their home. They had a large house up near the North City Wall. She had spent most of that day looking from the shadows. It didn't seem like a bad life. There were at least 6 of them in the house. She had seen 2 of them kiss once. Lysandra supposed that made sense. They weren't going to collar them twice. Her thoughts once again returned to Lara. Wild ideas rushed through her head. What if we were collared? If Lara and I were caught and sentenced, would those women welcome us? It wouldn't be this life, but at least we would be together. These were dumb ideas. Childish fantasies of eloping lovers and secret hideaways. And they were all she had at that moment. She embraced the fantasies because the reality of it all was staring her in the face, and it broke her heart to meet its gaze. Applause snapped her out of her musings as she noticed the prince and Lara departing the hall. Lysandra couldn't bear looking at them. After a while, with the sound of trumpets, they both boarded a royal chariot, and the last thing Lysandra heard was the sound of hooves. The party turned to their gossip once again. They were much louder this time. Lysandra felt alone, not needed. She supposed that last one was true enough, so she left the plates, took one last look at the hall, and went to her room. She passed old Harriet mumbling something to another servant, and they both shot her a dirty look. That's fine, she thought. I'll soon be out of your hair as well. It was the dead of night when she was shocked awake by someone entering her bed. She was about to say something when she felt a hand in the dark covering her mouth. She knew that hand. Delicate and gentle, she knew the perfume, and she knew the soft voice that whispered, "It's me." Harriet Barnes smirked the whole evening after seeing the street rat at the party. Her time was about to end. 20 years I served the Dunstons. I practically raised the young lady. And you would now take my place? Oh, I think not, little rat. I think not. She snuck away when the prince arrived and made her way to the servants' rooms. She had the key. She had all the keys. She was a trusted servant, not some street rat picked on a whim by a fickle child who would easily forget the kindness of old Harriet. This was fine. She knew how to get rid of the unwanted. She knew all that could be known in this house. Harriet knew where the young lady's expensive jewelry was kept, knew how and when to get it, and she had a very good idea where it should be found. While everyone was applauding the engagement, Harriet put a jeweled gold necklace under Lysandra's mattress. She stood up, looked at the room around her, and smiled. "What are you doing here?" Lysandra whispered as her eyes got used to the dark and saw Lara's hair and face reflecting the moonlight that poured through her small window. Was I not clear about that this morning? No, yes, but I saw you leaving with the prince. A short appearance for the crowd and the city elders, but that's all. The wedding is in 3 months still. Lysandra was silent. Lisa? She smiled. It was a sad smile. Don't. You know this is pointless. Lara stood up a little, leaning on one arm, and studied Lysandra's face in the dark. Tears glistened in the moonlight. Lisa, please. You will be married in 3 months, and you will leave. There is no future for this. You don't know that, Lara said. Okay, how? How do you see us going forward? We are in Dalkoffberg. If anyone found out about us... I am not forbidden to bring my maid to the palace with me, away from Dalkoffberg. And then what? Lysandra could barely hold back the sob. I would be the queen's dirty little secret for life? Or until we are discovered and you have to get rid of me? No! I would never be rid of you. She was crying. Lysandra could hear it and could no longer hold back. To devils with the future. She was crying now, and Lysandra couldn't take it. She kissed her in the dark and felt Lara sink into her kiss, soft, tender. She removed her nightgown, and they made love in the moonlight, muffling their own moans of pleasure. They indulged in their secret and celebrated the moment, and then the world exploded around them. It wasn't the explosion of passion they were nearing. No, instead it was harsh light from the doors that just opened, and standing there was old maid Harriet with 2 guardsmen and an annoyed-looking Lord Dunstan.
"Wake up, thief!"
Harriet proclaimed loudly, and then was left wordless. There, for all to see, Lysandra and Lara lay entwined in their love for each other. Harriet's face was warped with incredulous rage.
"Harlot! Demon whore! Nightlust! Corrupter of the—"
"Silence!"
Lord Dunstan shouted, then turned to the hallway and ordered the peeking servants who were woken by the ruckus to return to their rooms. He stood there silently, looking at Lara and Lysandra, then looked away.
"Father,"
Lara called.
"Get dressed, both of you,"
he said, and closed the doors while leaving the candle in the room. They were taken in 2 different chariots, Lara pleading with her father not to do what she knew he was going to do. It was to no avail. Lysandra knew what was going to happen as well. This was the law of the city, an old law from days forgotten by most. She worried, but her worries were different from Lara's. Life taught her not to dwell on her misfortune, because there was never time for that. They were going to be collared. There was no escaping the law of the elders. This much she was sure of. What did that mean for them, though? Worst outcome, Lara's father disowns her. It was a terrible possibility, but a plausible one, she thought. Where, then? The working house would never take them in. They would need shelter, so Lysandra would take her to the only place that might accept them, the big house at the northern wall where others like them resided. Lara would need to learn hard labor. It would be difficult, but still, they would be together. There were other options, and she was about to consider them when the chariot stopped, and she was pulled out and brought into the hall of the elders. It was a large, circular building, older than most, if not all, of the other buildings in the city. It stood out both physically, as it was the center of a large square, and by its material. It was one of the only 2 buildings in the city built from the same black stones that comprised Castle Dalkoff. Surrounding the building were 5 black freestanding pillars, each topped with an orb, 3 made of metal and 2 of stone. It was an old place, filled with old secrets and housing old people. In a way, Dalkoffburg bowed down to 3 rulers: the nobility, the Traders' Guild, and the elders. And of those 3, it was the elders who maintained the old laws, because they were the only ones among the 3 who could read them. They kept old knowledge from disappearing the way it does when told over generations. All of the old stories that twisted and changed through centuries of retelling, the elders knew them in their original form. In a way, they were the true judges of the city. And Lysandra was brought in for just that. Her judgment. Lara was brought in a few minutes later in tears, her father whispering something energetically. Lysandra saw Lara pleading once more, but he cut her off, this time loudly enough for Lysandra to hear.
"None of that, Lara. You will abandon this nonsense and act like the queen you are meant to be."
3 elders entered the room then, old grumpy folk worthy of their name. 1 hairless, 1 toothless, and 1 with a large wart on her forehead. There were more of them, however. At that late hour, not even Lord Dunstan's name could have gathered them all.
"Lord Barnaby Dunstan, what is this business of transgression we were told about? Waking an old woman from her sleep like that. Very unbefitting,"
Wart said, looking at Lord Dunstan with the scornful eye of a displeased teacher. Hairless added,
"And unusual. Transgressions are a serious business, but surely this could have waited until morning."
Toothless, however, whispered something to both of them, and pointed his bony finger at Lysandra. She noticed their eyes widen as they turned to look at her.
"Never mind,"
Hairless said.
"We see that it is a matter of some urgency. And the other transgressor?"
"My daughter, Eminences."
This riled them up, vigorous whispering among the three. Every now and then they looked at Laura and then at Lysandra, and Lysandra could have sworn she heard one of them call her Melanie and Devil Reborn. It didn't take long for them to reach their conclusion.
"The laws are clear on this, Lord Dunstan. Colouring for both of them."
"Your Eminences, my daughter—" It was a lapse of judgment. "You see, she is to be wed soon."
"We heard,"
Wart said, but allowed Lord Dunstan to continue.
"She was nervous, so she looked for comfort with her servant. It was a fleeting moment, nothing more. Surely some leniency."
"Our laws have kept us safe because we have honoured them, Lord Dunstan,"
Hairless proclaimed with an immodest air of self-importance.
"That being said, given the impact and proximity of your daughter's wedding, some leniency is, I think, possible." "Tell me, child,"
Wart now continued, speaking directly to Laura,
"do you renounce this temptress? Was your transgression a lapse in judgment and no more than that?"
Lysandra saw Lord Dunstan's hand on Laura's shoulder grip her tighter, saw her tears.
"Well?"
Wart urged. Lysandra saw Laura starting to shake her head at her father, her face in absolute agony, and she couldn't stand it anymore. "Tell them!" Lysandra shouted suddenly. "Tell them what you told me! You were afraid of your wedding night and wanted someone to help you understand what it was like to satisfy a man, and I showed you." Laura stared at her, eyes now red with tears, incredulous.
"Well, child,"
Wart continued with a deeply encouraging tone of voice,
"is this how it happened?"
Laura kept looking at Lysandra. Unable to speak, Lysandra smiled and nodded. She turned away from her. Laura sobbed relentlessly, her father pushing her to speak.
"Well, Laura, come on, speak up. Was it so? Was it so, Laura?"
"Yes."
"Very well. Lord Dunstan, you would do well to keep her indoors until her wedding day, we think. She does not require collaring. This one, however—"
Lysandra heard her sentence, but she didn't respond. She was hollow, uncaring. Their voices were nothing to her. She knew there was no future for them. She knew it was hopeless from the beginning. In a way, this was the only way it could have ended. She faintly remembered Laura screaming her name as she was led to the forge under the great hall. She was bound, tightly secured in a chair. The smith received a key from one of the elders, probably the toothless one. Lysandra didn't care. The smith used the key to open a large safety box built inside the building wall. From it, he removed one of about a few dozen peculiar-looking necklaces. They called them collars. However, they were really a series of metal plates linked together, with the final link left unwelded. Smith then heated up this remaining link, and they placed a wet cloth behind her neck. Metal was made red-hot and very pliable. The collar was then placed around her neck, the wet cloth serving as a shield from the heated part. The smith then used the back part of the chair as a small anvil and hammered the heated link until the metal was good and fused. The collar was in place, and they cooled it off with cold water, much of it going down Lysandra's back, briefly snapping her out of her apathy. What came after was worse. They didn't properly cool the metal before removing the wet piece of cloth, and it burned her skin. She screamed, partly from the pain, the rest from a broken heart.